Jessica Holmes, welcome to Planet Waves FM and Planet Waves TV.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Excellent, good. So, if I'm understanding it correctly, you're a professor of English at, is it Eastern Oregon University? It's a public school in Eastern Oregon where no one ever goes.
Yep, middle of nowhere. Just where you want to be.
Right near Twin Peaks. So that's Eastern Washington, right? Yeah, that's Eastern Washington, in the middle of a forest when you actually plot it. So, you teach English. So English professors, very high props in my book because you read a lot. English professors have a broad base of knowledge because of all this reading and comparative literature. But you've also taught some women's studies. You've got some women's studies classes, and you've got your favorite feminist literature class, which I'd like to take someday.
Yeah.
So my question coming into this, and I think our conversation is, what happened to Roe versus Wade? And along with that, what happened to feminism? How is this possible that in woke 2022 they can just do this?
Yeah. Well, do you want to start back in the 70s, or do you want to kind of start today and work our way back?
Well, let's start in the 70s, because Roe versus Wade is a creature of the early 1970s, and most people haven't even read the decision. But what was the historical, context around that?
Yeah, I think it's really important, and I think there's obviously a lot of discussion of Roe going on in light of the recent leak and then the subsequent overturning. I don't think the modern left or right really has a clear understanding of, I don't think they've read it, certainly, but I think a lot of people have kind of forgotten what Roe was, because over the past few decades, right, it's kind of been held up as this protection, right? This is our right to abortion as women. And I mean, to some extent, that's true. But I think a big part of what happened in the 70s leading up to Roe was really just a watering down of the original feminist demand, which was to have no government control, no government intervention whatsoever in terms of right to abortion. And so Roe in particular, right, it was based on New York State legislation. And it was really kind of just watered down. And ultimately, how I see Roe, and I mean, I am somebody who's pro-choice. I'm coming from the left, though I think that term is, I don't know. I feel like I have to give a bunch of caveats whenever I say I'm coming from the left. But to me, Roe did not give women the right to abortion. It gave the right to the state to
regulate abortion.
Exactly, to regulate it, to allow certain women, right, under certain circumstances, to undergo medical abortions carried out by industrial physicians in industrial facilities, right? So yeah, I mean, it is in some sense, a very narrow protection in terms of abortion itself, right? The other thing that I want to mention, just in kind of setting up this conversation, is, the early 70s, right? You were seeing the rise of women's health groups. You were seeing, a lot of people know about the Jane Collective, right? I think they did like 10,000, maybe more abortions with no negative outcomes, like no deaths, none of the sort of horror, like coat hanger stories that we
menstrual extraction. Were they doing menstrual extraction?
Yeah, exactly. And so there was a significant and increasing sort of sector of like what I would call feminists who were taking things into their own hands and taking control of their own bodies, not just in terms of abortion, more broadly speaking. And I believe that some of that was actually cited in some of the footnotes in the actual Roe legislation, right? So it's interesting to kind of think about that context in a way that the state saw that as a threat, right? Like you can't have women just going about their business, like doing, taking care of their own health. So yeah, I mean that it certainly, in some sense, right, was framed as liberatory, like left wing protection in terms of abortion. But looking back, and especially in light of the last few years, I think we can also see a threat in terms of, just more broadly speaking, to the state at large.
Yeah. I mean, in that era, Our Bodies Ourselves comes out in 1970. Betty Dodson's work starts coming out in various different forms, Ms. Magazine, and then this is really a product of the early 19th. This is an early edition of Sex for One. So this spirit was in the air of women having autonomy and independence from the male power establishment, otherwise known as the patriarchy. And your reading of Roe and my reading of Roe are exactly the same. When I read that, I thought, well, this is a conservative ruling. This is not a liberal ruling. This is a conservative ruling because conservatism is about the protection of state power. And to me, the entire thing, on first reading, without even being coached or anything, it read to me like the state was preserving its power to regulate this medical procedure rather than granting women the right to have it. As a consequence, women could pretty much get an unrestricted, unfettered abortion for maybe the first half of the pregnancy, but it didn't seem very generous in that sense. And the angle of hospitals, I had not noticed that it's really only is about medical doctors performing medical abortions in hospitals.
Yeah. Well, and then abortion clinics.
And abortion clinics, which are a form of an outpatient setting.
Right.
Okay. Whereas I've read stuff that you sent me where it was like, well, no, this has to be an unregulated procedure. But how is that better than, I mean, didn't things get better after Roe? At least for a while?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think like that shift from, I guess, largely like second wave feminism and different iterations of that in the 60s, 70s, sort of into the early 80s. The shift, right, took some time to go from that to like postmodern, what some people called third wave, 1990s on, which I guess I would argue that we're still kind of in that moment, although there's been the entrance of like queer theory and other factors. It took some time, and I want to make sure I'm being clear. I am certainly not celebrating this overturning of Roe. I think it's quite serious when the state criminalizes, well, anything, but certainly when you're talking about the inside of people's bodies, right, and their very, very, very intimate decisions, health decisions, personal decisions, family decisions, right? And women will die. Like women will die because of this overturning. So it's not that I don't think it's significant. I'm just frustrated with the way that it's being framed on both sides of the aisle, and even in some sort of independent media circles as well.
Yep, I understand, and I agree with that we really need a deeper historical look at this. I mean, look, my great grandmother had numerous kitchen table abortions. When I figured out that on my mother's side of the family, they only had 3 children, but on my father's side of the family, his mother had something like 11 siblings, and his father had 11 siblings. But there were only a couple on the other side of the family. When I was little, they lied and said condoms, and then when I got older, I understood that they had an abortionist. And this is horrible that you have to go through an illegal procedure. So, in my estimation of Roe versus Wade, it created kind of a buffer zone
Yeah.
where certain women had access for a while.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there was a consistent policy throughout the United States. That was very important.
Right.
Up to that point, it was like it is today, only a month on, a hodgepodge.
Yeah.
Okay, so where do you take it from there? And maybe, yeah, if you carry the story forward for the next few years, please, I'd be very happy to hear your perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess just kind of looking, as the decades moved on, right? And I mean, I'm relatively young, so I was not alive during like second wave feminism at all. So I have grown up in an environment where, largely, especially in terms of the mainstream left, right, feminism has been framed through things like personal agency, choice, right? And this very much kind of aligns with the framing of Roe specifically, right? With Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right, and all the way up to contemporary left wing politicians, AOC and Elizabeth Warren, right, and this idea that like this is the precedent, right? This is the be all end all, and I think over that length of time, you've also seen an increasing capture, increasingly like intrusive capture in terms of the medical industry at large, right? It's become a bigger and bigger and bigger part of our lives, especially the past few years. But this has not been, I don't see it as sort of like a non-linear sudden intervention. We've seen, and I said this before we started filming, right? But I think a big part of this whole discourse is to do with the disassociation from our bodies, especially for women. And I think the notion of safety, right? And I'm not trying to downplay some of those kitchen table abortions that you're referencing. There were certainly, anytime something's criminalized, right, there's going to be violence, and there's going to be, what I assume the people at the top kind of see as just collateral damage, right? But I think as the medical industry has gotten more and more powerful, right, the drug companies and pharmaceutical corporation has pretty much merged with the government. We have this like really, really strong association between modern industrial medicine and safety, right? So like to even suggest in 2022 that you might go elsewhere, right, for an abortion, immediately people associate it with coat hangers and mostly like exploitative, often it was oftentimes exploitative male doctors who were kind of jumping on the situation. So I think that like that notion of safety is really interesting to track over, since the 70s all the way up to today. Maybe I'll pause there, see if you have thoughts.
Right. So we have a real question of what's going to happen in states where it's an illegal procedure. Right. And first of all, from a medical standpoint, and then second, my concern throughout this decline in messaging on the issue has been that we could easily see not only the criminalizing of abortion, but the criminalizing of women who had miscarriages, and women can go to jail for having miscarriages. This opens the door to so many things that were not really factors 50 years ago, were not as pronounced as factors because the environment was not as politicized around this issue as it is today. You know what I mean? It's one thing when it's modestly politicized, and it's another thing when it's absolutely entirely politicized.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, you don't, I agree that the politicization has gotten, it's so extreme now. But you do, I mean, even if you look back, right, especially in Catholic hospitals, right, like that, I mean, just objectively, right, in terms of, I don't want to say symptoms, but in terms of just objective reality, an abortion and a miscarriage, right? They look really similar. Oftentimes they're indistinguishable. And so you've seen that around the world in terms of Catholic hospitals, right? You've seen women criminalized, and even going all the way back to like the witch hunts and the demonization of the original sort of traditional profession of midwifery, which I mean, many of those women were killed, tortured, right? And a miscarriage was a big part of it, right? Like miscarriage was associated with killing babies because it looked, to in terms of state surveillance, right? Like it looked like abortion. So I don't think that we have to use too much imagination to see where this is going. I think in terms of this overruling, like you're gonna see, I mean, there's always the women at the top, like middle class women, upper class women, they're easily bought off. This is not going to change that much for them. If they want an abortion, they're going to be able to go, travel and go to a different state if they need to. It's obviously poor women of color.
They just have the doctor come to their house. Is this
right, or that, yeah.
$5,000? It's worth a trip. It's worth a slight risk.
Yeah. So it's obviously going to be the women at the bottom of the economic and social hierarchy that are going to suffer the most. I do have some hope in the sense that I think there is, I don't know. I mean, maybe it's because I'm a part of these circles, but I do see an increasing interest in more holistic approaches to health and things like fertility awareness, like kind of coming back around women's circles. And I think, I mean, that's the one hopeful kind of take I guess I have on this overruling is that it is going to push like for the few women who either are already kind of connected to those types of circles or spaces, and then women who, get exposed to that type of information and want to kind of seek out a whole different paradigm for women's health and maybe health at large. I think that there's a lot of energy moving in a positive direction there. That said, it's going to take some time, and for women who don't realize that that's a choice and don't have those kind of resources or access, or it's going to be really brutal.
Yep. And there are all these different situations where abortion is a very important out. For example, rape and incest of a minor, rape and incest of any woman, right? I mean, effectively, there are going to be places where where the quote unquote overturning of Roe versus Wade means that a man can force a woman to have his child. When you cannot abort a pregnancy that's the product of rape, and of course any rape conviction is going to take longer than 9 months to happen, so it's not like there can be proof, and there's never really a jury verdict, so it's irrelevant to have a proof standard. This just to me opens up a world of crisis for millions of women we've never heard of, including many that haven't even been born today, and all done in the guise of protecting fetuses, when I really think this is about destroying women.
Yeah, I mean, the debate, right, about when does life begin, I mean, in some sense, the right-wing position is much more coherent. I mean, I disagree with it, but it is much more coherent than the mainstream left today.
Yep.
but ultimately, right, it's a human rights issue at the level, like, you can't make somebody's body life support for another person, right? Like, even if you want to consider the fetus a person, right, with full, like, legal status, it just it doesn't hold up, right? The only way that you can justify that is to reduce the woman to an object, an incubator,
Birthing pod, that's what I call it.
birthing pod.
Birthing pod.
Yeah, yeah, and it's
That's really what they're saying.
yeah, and it gets really complicated too. I like we've seen the rise of things like IVF and all of these, because we have such an infertility crisis, which of course the pharmaceutical industry has nothing to do with how that came about, right? But you've got so many. I mean, I feel like I know just as many women who have pursued that path as opposed to a more natural pregnancy. When you've got, I mean, literal, like, incubation methods, right? You've got also, however many eggs being harvested and frozen, it suddenly gets very complicated in terms of, well, does each of those eggs suddenly have a right to life, right? Under legislation? And it sounds ridiculous, but I mean, if you follow this logic to its conclusion, especially in light of the technology that's becoming so pervasive, it gets really really crazy. And you do start to have to contemplate, like, this, what I would call, like, a transhumanist future where, are we talking about the woman being removed entirely? Are we talking about literally a birthing pod, where you don't even need a woman, right, anymore? If you can just keep something alive in a pod, right? Injecting synthetic hormones, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that kind of line of thinking as well.
Yeah, that's how it's done in the book Woman on the Edge of Time by Marge Piercy. You might know this book. A kind of a I don't know, it's a classic and deserves to be one. And that's there's a lot about gender in there, and she rewrites the entire English language to take the gender out, making like 5 edits. It's very simple. But as part of this book, and set place like in 200 years in the future in Massachusetts, women do not give birth.
Yeah.
The kids are all born in they're on little tank farms. They're gestated in tank farms.
Well, and it, like, I guess in terms of my own feminism, I am closer to, like, what most people would call, like, radical feminist, second wave, that type of thing. But I do think there's an important critique of that in the 60s, 70s thinking, where birth started to be framed as this huge burden, right? And you can see that, and how that has become part of this discourse of, like, well, birth is painful and it's dangerous, right? Like, our whole medical paradigm, our whole culture treats birth like a medical emergency, right?
Yeah.
Watch any movie, right? It's like, oh my God, throw her in the taxi, right? Like, as if she's, bleeding out or something, as opposed to, creating a human in what should be a very relatively safe, natural, physiological series of events. So I think that's part of it too, is this idea of, like, well, we could liberate women by sort of removing this danger and this burden. And I think that's really, I think that thinking is actually quite dangerous in and of itself.
Though at the moment, we have more immediate concerns, like, for example, women being prosecuted for a miscarriage,
right?
Because maybe their partner is angry at them and says that they really aborted it. We're looking at the surveillance of every pregnancy, potentially a regulation issue where, for example, if you end up being known to give birth, you register a birth, if you did not previously register the pregnancy, you face some criminal penalty, which would require the registration of every pregnancy so that every pregnancy could be tracked. I mean, I'm aware from what you've sent me that there were these kind of word of mouth surveillance systems going on even in the 1500s, even during the burning times. There would be the hunt for lactating women.
Yeah. And snitch
Right.
culture too, right? Which
yeah, sure. That's the snitch culture. Yes. So now we have much better surveillance technology. Hey, we're participating in it. We have much better surveillance technology where it's not inconceivable that an app on your phone could detect that you were pregnant.
Yeah. Well, many women track their their fertility cycle on these apps. Big fertilities become a huge industry. So I don't, it's disturbing, but I don't even think it's something where for a lot of women, like they're going to consent to it without even having to have the hammer of, what we think of like state surveillance, like coming down, like they're already doing it, right? It's just another app, and it's framed as liberatory, right? It particularly preys on women who are actually more kind of predisposed to wanting to return to more natural cycles and to get away from pharmaceuticals and all of this, right? And it's like, well, funnel them right into the arms of big tech in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, and I will admit that in a world where I have found in the long and storied history of my sexual career that from the time I started till today, in my observation, women have become less careful about birth control and about pregnancy. And obviously, hormone birth control is a bad option. Women don't directly have control where condoms are involved. And for me, if you didn't say, well, I'm on this birth control method or that birth control method, all I asked in my personal life was that you bring something to the table, that you not have nothing to bring to the table. And a fertility app to me was at least something we could talk about. It at least keyed me into a woman's consciousness of her body and her ability to get pregnant in the first place, and that she might or might not want to. It's not just a thing that you succumb to when your eggs are screaming and you will accept any sperm, because a lot of women go through this, and we always blame guys for thinking with their dicks, but we never account for the extent to which women think with their eggs. The incredible power this has.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's obviously been, a huge, I do think a huge burden in terms of the share of responsibility that's been placed on women in terms of methods of birth control. And I don't think that the majority of men are, even as conscientious as you're kind of describing your process right in the past.
Really? You don't think that all guys are? No, they're not. They're like, let's get drunk and fuck, and whatever happens, happens. And if there's a kid, it's your problem. But they don't have any contact with family court, words which should not go together. The most egregious horror stories come out of family court. There's a need to have family. I don't care what the origins of Planned Parenthood are, and what's her name is a complete lunatic, whatever that wench was that started. So you can just tell there's something wrong with her. But forgetting all of that, the obviously in the modern world where we're not living in villages, and where our responsibilities are much more important than like harvesting rice 3 months out of the year. It matters whether we have the ability to have family planning. And my concern, one of my many concerns is that Roe versus Wade was based on Griswold versus Connecticut's privacy theory. Well, they just chopped off that whole line of legal reasoning, and there's nothing to stop them from going up the tree and shutting down Griswold or Obergefell. That's it. They've moved into the territory.
Yeah, and I guess kind of back on the responsibility thing. I don't know, you tell me what you think, but I think there's also a kind of detachment or like disassociation that's happened, especially in the really young generations coming up right now, who have just been so heavily like indoctrinated into both tech and pharma. I mean, I don't know what percentage of young people in the United States are on, some kind of pharmaceutical, anti-anxiety, anti-depression. It's high.
Most of them.
And then, of course, birth control for women, increasingly young, like girls, right? Oftentimes for reasons have nothing to do with contraception, right? It's being used off-label for all sorts of things, which
all sorts of things
mask symptoms, right? That could be dealt with. That's another story, but I think there's kind of a disassociation that's happened in the cultural mindset of young people that like sex and reproduction like aren't thought of together, right? I mean, on the one hand, there's definitely a fear mongering. I think, I experienced this as a young girl. It's like if you so much as like lay a pinky finger on a guy, right, like you might get pregnant, right? So there's
this Christian shit. Yes.
Yeah, and a lot of us grew up like not even realizing that women are only fertile during, maybe a week out of their cycle at most. But I think, for one, like young people are having less sex today. We could talk about the reasons for that, what we think they might be, but yeah, I don't think, especially young men, and I spend a lot of time being, as a university professor, I spend a lot of time with like 18 to 22-year-olds, and I think there's this detachment, right? And it's like, well, no matter what level of birth control you're on, right, like there's always a chance, like that's just, and I'm not, obviously it's not, I don't want to propagate some like anti-sex, sex negative, as they say, ideology. It's not that at all, right? But I do think there's something that's happened where suddenly it's become separate, right? When in fact it's like, well, no, this is how you reproduce, right? Just at a physiological level. It doesn't mean that, things like pleasure and connection and all of that are unimportant, or even, can be more important. But I think something's happened where it's not like there's sex and then there's reproduction. I don't know. Do you think you're?
Well, I can tell you a funny story. Maybe 10 years ago, I had a summer intern, Liz Fizz, and we lizfizz.biz was the domain that I got her.
Great name.
And she was a photography intern, and we went to this little carnival that comes to the supermarket parking lot near my apartment. And we're walking through the thing, and I said, there's all these people pushing strollers around, and I said, I bet half of these people don't even know that having sex leads to babies. And she could have said a lot of things, right? But I turn and look at her, and she gives me this earnest look, and she says, yeah, I knew these people who said they were just getting married, and somehow the discussion of, or they were just getting together, the discussion of whether they should have sex came up, and they said, we don't think we're ready for sex. We're going to have some babies first. Like, wow. I got that one. They don't know that sex leads to babies. So yes, this is disembodied reality, right? This is, people have known this a long time, that sex leads to babies. And it's only in the 21st century that we might not grasp that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
where do you want to go from here?
Well, let's see. I'm always curious what people who are talking to 18 to 22-year-olds have to say about what they think. Why do you think that they're having less sex?
Well, I mean, short term, for the past 2 years, most of them have been locked in their abodes, right? Glued to a computer screen. So there's that. But I do think just largely the tech is a big part of it. I think porn culture is a big part of it, which obviously connects to the tech. I think this is what I hear from students is that the reality is that for all the, supposedly progressive sex education classes, that have cropped up in more liberal places in this country, it's pretty pathetic in the grand scheme of things. I mean, porn is especially for young men, I think it's like age 10 or 11 is on average when they're first encountering this stuff, and that becomes their education. For females, I mean, we grow up under patriarchy. It may not look quite like it looked 300 years ago, but it's a daily reality.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think you introduce tech as sort of the central mode of how young people are communicating. It's social media. Now their schooling is all through Zoom or Canvas or Microsoft or Google or whatever. They're spending insane amounts of time on here, right? And this is to me, yes, it can facilitate the exchange of information and certain types of connection, but it is disembodied. Like you said, like it is not the same thing as being in person and creating real relationships, including, friendships and familial relationships and mentorships, right? Like I'm not just talking about sexual relationships or, romantic relationships. So I think that's a big part of it. I think pharma as well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, everything has become so pathologized, so medicalized, including sex. I mean, to the point where a lot of feminists, well, not a lot, but some feminists right now would argue that essentially, right, like the whole concept of sex, and especially like sex-based classes, is under threat of complete erasure, right, with the whole gender ideology notion, right, which is very connected to this idea of a disembodiment and a disconnection from material reality. So I think that is also becoming an increasingly big factor. And of course, it's framed through liberation and inclusion and all of this, right alongside the rest of the playbook.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the porn today is not the porn of when I was a kid. I might have discovered my dad's collection of Playboys and Penthouse magazines when I was 12, but that was very sweet and softcore and almost classical imagery that you could just kind of put in a frame and put in an art museum, even though it was Playboy or Penthouse. Today it's like, it's
terrifying, especially for young women. It's like it's a like terror campaign. I mean, I really like it's horrible.
Yeah.
And it's an industry, right? It's not, you can frame whatever sex, individual choice, the sex work is work mantra, all of this, right? But ultimately it's an industry, and it's a really violent, exploitative one. So I think it's really frightening that this is what 10, 11-year-olds are being exposed to. And I hear myself and I said, I know to some people, like, it sounds like a right-wing talking point, and it shouldn't be, right? Like, no. On the left, we're supposed to be critical of industry.
Right. And it gets complicated where any artwork that depicts erotic experience it has always been censored. There's always been an effort to refuse to allow the portrayal of sexuality, including of banning words, banning whole classes of people. You know, all these sex workers we rally for, well, what has been their role in history? They are among the silenced, marginalized, completely disappeared class of people who served as advisors and who have helped people through difficult situations. You know, the relationship of sex workers to their clients is very complex, and they're gone from history. We never hear about them. Who do we? I mean, it would be interesting to even do a class on who are the known sex workers who have made it into known history. And men don't talk about it either. I know very few men who will admit to ever having gone to a sex worker. I was at a coffee shop up down in New Paltz, Stewart Shops, and I just went in. I did not need a cup of decaf at 10 o'clock at night, but I go in, I get my decaf, I come out, and there's this old black guy sitting at a table with a pile of newspapers, crinkled up and folded with books and papers. And he's about 84. And I stopped and I said, "Oh, you look literate." And he looked up at me like, "I know who this is. This is Zelbert Moore, the retired professor emeritus, we got talking, and he had stories for me, stories of sex workers around the world. You never hear men talk about this. It was astounding to hear. He was regaling me. It's hard to do that. I usually have better stories than anyone. And here he is. So the whole fact of sex work is marginalized. Marginalized means it becomes corrupt. Once it's concealed, once it's pushed underground. Okay, I'm not sure where I'm going with this. It's now been subsumed into porn by things like OnlyFans.
Yeah.
Right, which is the kind of girlfriend experience, right? It's kind of like custom porn. The cheap version is $15 a month, porn from this one person. But for a fee, you get some personalized porn where they say your name or something like this. I think this is where sex is going, but I think that the medium quality, the energetic quality of video is making people not interested in physical reality.
Yeah.
More than the content of it.
Well, and what did we see during COVID, right? I think OnlyFans exploded. I think it
had to.
In terms of members, it went up by like 70, 75, 80%, something like that, right? Of women joining OnlyFans. So on the like sex worker end, right, you have disproportionately women who, I mean, what, they're going on there because they feel empowered all of a sudden? No, it's because there's economic collapse, right? And they're being deprived of their livelihood because of the lockdowns, because of the mandates, all of this, right? And then on the other end, right, like you said, the consumer end, right? And it's all of the language has become so capitalistic. So it's all, clients and services, even like worker. I mean, we could talk about even just the term like sex worker, but yeah, I mean, energetically, right? And also you have during COVID especially, but over the past couple of decades, like the sex toy industry totally exploded, right? And it's, again, like, it's not to say people, I'm not trying to police what people do in their bedrooms. No, like whatever pleasure you want, that's great, right? But I don't think it's a coincidence that we have all of this tech coming up, right? It's like devices. You're consuming all of this stuff through visual mediums, through screens, right? It's all contributing to this disconnection. And I think just on the taboo thing, about how you said most men won't even admit, even though I don't know what percentage, I'm sure it depends on what part of the world, but it's very common. Even with pornography, I think it's really interesting how taboo it still is. Like in some of my classes, like we bring it up, and we're supposed to be like this enlightened, progressive culture, right? But when we talk about like mainstream porn, I mean, there's something on the one hand like very honest about it, and sex work too, because a lot of it is, falls into this like the racism, right? The obviously the sexism, just the brutality of a lot of it, so violent. It really kind of lays bare, I think, like where we are as a society. I mean, I don't want to be be graphic or vulgar, right? But like a lot of the pornography, like it is openly racist. Same thing.
Tell me about that. I mean, I've studied porn. Tell me. So I have not seen the brutality, and I don't consider top bottom play to be brutality. I've never seen anything depicted that looked like a rape or was. Now, I mean, maybe I've missed some things. My tastes generally don't go in that direction, and my curiosity doesn't go in that direction.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I remember one of the first radical feminist texts that I read was Gail Dines' work, right? Who's like probably known, I think, as like the most famous anti-porn activist, at least in sort of modern times. So I think, I mean, her work talks a lot about, just the Gonzo genre, and she has a couple
The Gonzo genre? What's the Gonzo genre?
I mean, it's basically like really hardcore, and even that term I think is so subjective, because like you said, I mean, what was pornography in 1950 is now, yeah, it
bumper sticker,
lame for like a billboard.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, you have just like the sort of like Black masculinity, like those prototypes, and the way that shows up in pornography, the racial dynamics. I mean, we could talk about like BDSM. It was really interesting. I taught a humanities class. It was a writing class on human sexuality a couple years back. I think it was like the first year of the COVID era. And the students were simultaneously taking my class, and then they were taking a science class, a psych class on human sexuality. And it was, so I got to sit in on a lot of those lectures, and it was super fascinating because the instructor was like advocating. I mean, I really would say she was advocating for things like safe choking and like a lot of the BDSM, like they had guest speakers and things coming in from different areas, and I found it. Go ahead.
Okay, no, please. I'm just marveling. You keep going. No, you're doing great. I'm learning a lot here.
Yeah.
Which this misses the point of top and bottom play.
Okay.
It's not about the things you do. It's about the psychological dynamics between the people. For one thing, it's not right. There's lots of techniques. Well, let's see. There's whips and floggers and canes and all these different things. You can go to a workshop and you can be like, okay, when you're using the cat of nine tails, this is what you do. But a flogger is much safer. Blah 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 blah. Yeah. No. Top bottom play is a psychological experiment.
Well, it's not that. I mean, I don't totally disagree, but I think, it's like the whole agency thing. Especially as a woman, like growing up in this culture, I think we've been conditioned to eroticize our own subjugation in a lot of ways. And so that's, to me, when you combine that with a multi-billion-dollar industry, like the sex work industry or like pornography, that's to me where it gets really blurry, right? What, something like BDSM, right? I think there's an argument that fetishizes this notion of oppression, right? And violence toward women.
But what makes you think that women are the subs? You know how many women doms there are who are paid more than white shoe attorneys? They paid $500 to $1,000 an hour. And it's rich men going to them to experiment with sub play. The men are not all tops. In fact, I've met very few male tops. I almost know exclusively female tops. And at least in the culture that I've come through, everything was negotiated impeccably, down to the safe word, down to the things you do and don't want to do, negotiation of the scene and how it plays out, and the dialogue. It's much more than is being portrayed by secondary sources. You kind of have to be there.
Yeah.
To see it and experience it personally.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Like, especially if we could talk about like the notion of masculinity and how that might have shifted just from sort of a cultural lens. But I do think, I mean, if you look at like sex work or pornography on like a global scale, especially global South, I mean, I think it is by and large women who are abused, who are, raped, who are, I don't know, like just this power dynamic, right? It's obviously been going on for centuries and centuries,
but top bottom play ritualizes that in a safe way. Well, that's what top bottom play really is.
What do you mean by safe, though?
Everybody says, let's do it. Like, let's have strawberry shortcake. If I'm going to do a scene with someone, we agree to the scene. We say, all right, what do we want? What do we need? What are we going to do?
Yeah.
How are we going to set this up? And the whole discussion happens. We talk about what we're going to do. There's a safe, the bottom has a safe word. Everyone knows that in real BDSM play, which is, it's not really bondage and domination and sadism and masochism. That's just completely wrong. No one's doing this because they're masochistic. Anyone who shows up for bottom play and pain play is doing it because they love it. So,
but are you talking about I feel like you're talking about a different kind of setting than like before we were talking about sort of mainstream pornography and mainstream sex work or prostitution. Like you're not. I don't know exactly what kind of context you're talking about here. So maybe put me in.
Well, I think that something processed into media is one thing, and something that you show up for as an experience is another thing.
Okay.
Right. So if you go to an S&M club, you playing by the house rules. And in any such place I've ever been, the women are very powerful. So there's something lost in translation when this is put onto the internet as a media product, as opposed to what's actually going on in the settings of various kinds where this is happening.
I don't disagree with that. I think that distinction's really, really important, especially when we're talking about sort of like cultural psychology and then how that plays out in power dynamics. But I also, I'd be curious, like those women who are powerful, as you put it, like
it's playing the role top. It doesn't make them powerful. It means that they're the top.
Well, you said those women tend to have, like, you feel like they have a lot of power.
In the game.
In the game.
In the game.
Well, what about in reality, though? I mean, how long are these careers? Like, what are they being paid? Well,
okay, so I'm not evaluating the career trajectory of all of them. I've had conversations with a good few sex workers about their career trajectory. I'm probably the only guy sitting there paying for their time who talks to them about their career and what they do with their lives. But I've conducted quite a few informal interviews. And I could say a lot about it, and what I've learned from them. But as far as the kinds of women who participate in dungeons, who are professionals in dungeons, they pretty much have to have their shit together in a lot of ways. They have to be together. They have to be able to psychologically match the power of the men that they're dealing with. And yes, they do have the power of their sexuality, and the men are coming specifically to pay a lot of money to be submissive. But that in itself is a fascinating thing, that in the middle of all of this, you've got tons and tons of men paying $1,000 an hour to be submissive.
Yeah. So what's going on there? What is the appeal of that? Like,
There you go.
Where does that come from?
Well, a long time ago, and I got as far as having a paper copy of this, maybe we can find it. Erica Jong, who I trust as a writer, wrote an article for Penthouse called "Is Sex Sexy Without Power?"
Great title.
And her analysis. So she's looking at, why do people get into these situations, and why is it that a guy blindfolded and with his hands tied behind his back can have an orgasm when a woman dangles her panties in front of his face? What's going on with all this? And the 10-cent version of her conclusion is that we tend to seek power dynamics in sexual exchanges, that it's inherent in some way to experiment with that, which is why somebody might have an affair with their boss, even though they know that it's very dangerous. It's why a boss might have an affair with somebody who proposes to him or her. It helps explain. It certainly helps explain this incredible trend toward, basically. I wish there were a better word than BDSM clubs, but there's a lot of them. There in this whole societies and organizations that do this. They too are not immune. We saw during the Me Too movement, they're not immune from all the same shit that people put each other through. But at least they had ritualized things to the point where there was a detailed conversation ahead of anyone getting undressed, and where there was one word that could end the scene.
Yeah.
Portlandia spoofs this with the cacao script, with the cacao sketch, where they do the gender swapping thing, where what's his name becomes a guy and what's her name becomes a. Do you know Portlandia at all?
I know Portland. I don't know if I've seen that one.
So it's the cacao scene, and the safe word is cacao, and
that's good.
She keeps just saying cacao, 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 cacao. Everything is threatening. This is spoofing the fact that in top and bottom play, the bottom's in charge. And I think this is worth looking at, and it's almost too honest to look at in a university setting. You have to show up and find out. You have to experience it. You have to try it. You have to go and put on the leather and posit yourself as a top at a party, and get a male subject or female subject, and do whatever is in the rules of the game. See, so to turn that into something that's somehow non-consensual or violative, to me, is really to rob it of its beauty, because it is the ultimate discussion of consent, right down to the details. We're going to do a medical scene. Here's this, here's that. I'm into this, I'm not into that. And people go through all their things. It's almost a little too cut and dried in some ways. And then a ritual is enacted of some kind. This is good sex, I think. This is putting sex in the social realm where it belongs.
Yeah, I mean, again, I have no interest in anybody, including me, policing people's sex lives at all. So it's not even, I don't mean to sound judgmental about that type of experience. But I guess to kind of pan out, if we're talking about the pornography industry at large, sex work industry at large, I have a hard time judging it based on experiences like this one, right? When
Of mine?
there's or any argument for like, you know, ethical this or ethical that. We're actually having this conversation about sex work in particular on I do a podcast every week with a couple of my friends, and one of them was a sex worker for many years, and so we're kind of talking through some of this, and it's really interesting. And I think it's also interesting for me as somebody who's coming from more of like a feminist background, and who, you know, most of the like personal stories, I don't mean like secondary, like reading about them, but most of the, you know, real conversations I've had about this throughout the years have been with women. So it's interesting to hear male perspectives. But by and large, right, I think when you look at it, you look at the level of exploitation just on a global scale, like all the way up to the World Bank, right, and national GDPs. I think it's just hard for me to sort of hold up like what I see as exceptions, because I don't think these industries are largely marked by consent at all.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that kind of gets us, I guess, back to the beginning, right, of Roe v. Wade, and right, like we're living under patriarchy, we're living under capitalism. So it's really hard to like define something like choice, something like agency in sex, or just at all, when you're looking at the material conditions of, especially the, you know, the poorest people, the people in material conditions that are just inherently exploitative or just difficult, right?
Right. So I think the thing not being said about Roe versus Wade is that it really, in many ways, protected a woman's right to fuck, because it protected your right to have a mistake, to have a pregnancy that you didn't want, and you can terminate the pregnancy and go back to fucking. And the left has never stood up for that. The left has always made it about the right to terminate a pregnancy without saying why people might get pregnant. The right wing, on the other hand, knows exactly what it's trying to do, which is to suppress all forms of sex, at least for the middle class, basically.
Well, ostensibly, right? Like at least the appearance of that.
Yeah. And they're making it hard for people who are poorer also, because the abortions are disproportionately there. But the idea of abortion is that you can have a pregnancy as a consequence of sex and not have to have a child as a result of that. Mm-hmm. And so ultimately with the right to abortion, we're really talking about the right to have sex. And what I'm saying is that the left is just as skittish about saying things, and it's become very conservative in a way, and can't advocate this. They can't say, well, clearly having the right to end a pregnancy means continuing to have the sex life of your choice and not worrying that you might get pregnant, because you can terminate the pregnancy if you need to. But that is the objection to this, is all through the subtext of the right-wing tropes and arguments about sexuality. That abortion is a result of promiscuity, essentially. But the left, the so-called feminist movement, at least not since the 1990s, has certainly not spoken up for the right and privilege to have the sex of your choosing, because the feminist movement has been all about desexualizing women in that era, where now to recognize women as attractive is considered offensive. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
This is ridiculous.
Yeah, and I mean, to me, the whole thing is ridiculous, because you can argue. I don't know. I mean, you can argue about the morality of the birth control bill or the Plan B or first term abortion, second term abortion, right? Whatever. The reality is that women have been having abortions, have been having sex and have been having abortions forever, right? And just, I mean, just by nature of being a female, you have the ability to both create and destroy life. I mean, that's just a reality, right? You don't need the permission of the government, of your doctor in order to do that, right? I mean, even just basic knowledge of plant medicine, basic knowledge of herbs, right? And this is like so taboo to say now. But it goes back centuries and centuries. And so I think I don't know, the framing has been so successful. And yeah, that, like you said, like the right to fuck, right? I mean, that was the framing of the pill, right? It's like, you're liberated. Here, take this pill. And now you can have sex and you can enter the workforce and you're good. We're good. Everyone's equal, right? Problem solved. And it's just such a lie.
I agree at the very beginning. No, the work of second wave feminism was not really completed. It was barely even begun.
We're going backwards.
Yeah. What's that? What's your take on that?
Backwards, I think.
I have, well, okay. You mean from like 1965 to 1975, things went backwards?
Well, I don't know if I would say that. I meant from
Roe till today.
Today. I don't know if I would say that, but I think looking back, the groundwork that was laid just in terms of the narrative, like I'm not saying that, the pill shouldn't have come about and shouldn't be accessible to people. Same thing with abortion and Roe, but I think it's really just like oversimplified and painted over with this rosy, rosy-eyed narrative. But what were you going to say before I interrupted?
Well, okay, so I think where the work of second wave really, which is early 70s, late 60s, early 70s feminism, kind of abandoned ship was the working out of egalitarian relationships between women and men. It was basically quick fixes, and we want a job, and we want equal pay, and all that stuff. But that's not really, I don't think, what any of this is about. I don't think what the problem is about. I think the problem is about working out of more balanced relationships between women and men. And that is difficult, messy, taboo, frightening, territory requiring self-examination and the questioning of assumptions and looking at history and all that. And what it's really, it became a lot of attacking women for wanting to be mothers. This is what feminism was, and the right wing seized on this. The whole story of the Equal Rights Amendment going down is just completely tragic. This absolutely elegant, like 11-word amendment to the Constitution, which was just destroyed. And I've written many times that Roe was the only vestige of that we had, because at least it would allow a woman to terminate a relationship with a man that would be based on the child. Mm-hmm. And all the control that implies. So it was really break glass and pull the alarm, right? It's really the last ditch thing. It's not about teaching equality and equality meaning equal responsibility. Where was that? Now, my mom was a real second waver, and she was teaching ESL. It's called ESL at the time. It was okay to call it that, and had to teach the birth control component to these Haitian and Puerto Rican immigrants. And one night she came home with a big envelope of supplies and dumped it on the kitchen table and said, this is a condom. This is a loop. This is a copper 7. These are birth control pills. This is a diaphragm. This is spermicidal jelly. This is what it is. Here you go. Okay, but that only gets you so far, right? And that was very rare. There were not very many moms who did that, and who raised boys to be sensitive to the issue, and I recognize that I'm in an unusual case. The worst fear I've ever experienced, ever, I'm an investigative reporter. I do dangerous things, was thinking that a woman might be pregnant who I did not want to have a child with. And we were nowhere close to a close call. But in my mind, the anxiety took hold, the formation took hold. And I have never experienced anxiety like that. And it must be completely all consuming, all dominating. Oh my God, my life is over. That is the kind of anxiety and fear that many women experience when they think they might be pregnant with the wrong person, or they find out they are pregnant with the wrong person. And I do not think that most men can connect with that absolutely consuming anxiety over pregnancy.
Yeah.
That's missing. A lot of things are missing. The conversation, is this the right choice for us now? In my sex education materials, I say that every sexual experience should be preceded by a conversation whether this is the right thing for us now.
Yeah.
I don't think consent is a thing. I think the conversation between two people, is this the right thing for us now? Why and why not? Oh, and by the way, what if we get pregnant? What do we do? This is fantasy land. This is like, for most of the world, this is unreal. That's missing. Second wave feminism. So you've got a lot of complaints about guys. Okay, well, well, you think men are these imperfect, terrible, brutal creatures. Well, they're mostly raised by women in the first place. Okay, mostly raised by moms. How about that? And second, what do you really want, ladies? What do you want your sons to be in this world? What are you going to teach them how to be? That, to me, is feminism.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think I have my own critiques of the second wave as well. And I think even like the whole equality thing, like framing equality as the goal.
Yeah. Please go on.
Yeah, I mean, even just like a lot of what we've been talking about is like, okay, like material reality, right? Like, entering the workforce, I mean, obviously women should be able to work and have careers, and, I have a career and I'm very happy that I do. But I think it connects to what you said about like motherhood kind of being demonized, and even way back at the beginning of this conversation, talking about sort of this, to some extent, the second wave framing of birth and motherhood as burden, as sort of this major thing that was like holding women back from equality.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I've heard it like, this sort of silly analogy of like the pie, of like, we want a slice of the pie. Like, no, we want half the pie. And it's like, no, like, fuck the pie. Like, we don't want the pie at all. The pie is poisoned, right? And even just, since we're talking about fertility and pregnancy, right? Like the workforce thing. I mean, look at us today, right? Like women who want to breastfeed and also work at the same time. Women who, spend their whole pregnancy like just working insane hours so that they can get their full like 4 weeks, 6 weeks, maybe of maternity leave afterward. Like we're so far from a workplace that is designed to support women, right? And even just, I mean, our daily, like the way that our daily, it sounds so silly because people just can't imagine an alternative. But I mean, women's hormones work in such a way that like we don't have the same amount of energy every day, right? Like our hormones fluctuate over the span of our cycle. Men, largely the hormones are pretty much the same daily, right? So even
is that true? Is that scientifically true? Just checking. Have you looked into that?
Yeah, I mean, when you're in your follicular phase, on average, you're going to be more energetic. You're going to be more like on average. I'm not
with
saying
women,
everybody.
I know that there's fluctuations with women, and it's some women, all women experience menstruation differently. Some are like la di da. Some are knocked down for 2 days. There's
Right.
all kinds of anthropology we could do around this. There's all this anthropology done around menstrual cramps. We know that much. But for men, no one really looks at the male reproduction very carefully, actually. It's amazing how little is known
Yeah.
about it. But I agree there's
I mean,
vastly
our bodies
different
are
needs.
different. Like our bodies are different, right? And I personally find the whole kind of demonization of motherhood really quite sinister. And I'm not trying to hold it up as like, oh, this is like our purpose or whatever. Like, no, do whatever you want with your life, do whatever you want. But I think it's a gift. I don't think birth's a medical emergency. It's actually a sign of health, right? It's a sign of fertility and health. And I think when you remove the industrial pressures and surveillance and direct interventions, if that were to be the norm as opposed to the very, very marginalized taboo exception, we would be living in a very different society. And I think, yeah, like even that idea of like, what does it mean for a feminist to bring up a boy, right? That would look very different in a world where, like, I don't want to say like necessarily matriarchy, although for some of us, like that is the goal. But we have to imagine what alternatives would look like, because so often I think some of these conversations get reduced to just like, well, it's, men need sex, so we have to have like pornography, or we have to have whatever. Women suffer by having to give birth, and so we have to have epidurals and ultrasounds, and you have to have your feet in stirrups and needles coming at you from all angles, right, during this experience. And it's not true. It doesn't have to be that way.
No. And fortunately, in the late 60s and early 70s, there was quite a bit of natural childbirth, the return to natural childbirth. I'm now committed to getting my hands on a first edition of Our Bodies, Ourselves. That's got some incredible stuff in it. There was an undercurrent of truly woman positive, meaning biological woman positive teaching and sex positive teaching. And I think that at a certain point, Betty, for example, is a great, a very effective teacher at women being sexually independent, learning about your bodies and being comfortable around other women. And she did not have the lesbian agenda. A lot of feminism does, in fact, have a lesbian agenda. I mean, I flipped open one of my books. I've got a pretty good gender studies bookshelf, and I haven't read them all, but I flipped open one of them, and it said, I think it may have even been the Feminist Dictionary or Gynecology or something like that, and it was the goal is lesbianism, the means is feminism. Of course, we're seeking a lesbian society. And in someone's fantasy, you'd only need like 10 or 15 dudes per how many hundred women to create all the pregnancies you need. You just farm. I mean, I have some sci-fi I haven't finished, but scenes like, what's the scene where the milkmaids come and extract the semen from the guys, right? So, but there are people who have the vision of this kind of a world where there's no sex between men and women anymore.
Yeah.
Dworkin was not very chipper about it.
Yeah.
At all.
Yeah. And I think, a lot of that sentiment, which some of it, yeah, is kind of attributed to second wave. I love Andrea Dworkin. I've learned a lot from reading her work. And I think that, what's that quote that she did? the left can't have its whores and its politics too. I've been thinking about that a lot since the Roe overturning. But where I was going to take this is, looking now at the sort of transhumanist sort of bend that seems to be increasingly being normalized. And this seems to be the direction that is being pushed. I think that is in some sense like, we don't have sex. We don't need to have sex, right? Because we have tech, and women don't need to give birth, and we're just gonna transcend, right, and become these sort of de-sexed cyborgs, right? And it is very sci-fi, but I don't think we're as far from it as people think that we are.
I think you're right. And I'm concerned with all the reasons we might avoid the discussion, right? Because when you think of what all these cyborgy, we only need, one sperm donor for every 200 women or whatever the situation may be. All of this stuff sidesteps the need for men and women to work out and have a real conversation about what they want, what they need, what they want and what they need. I think it really comes down to that.
Yeah.
And a multi-level conversation. And digital is not friendly to this.
No.
The digital is not friendly to this conversation.
No, it's not. Do you have any hope for this kind of post-Roe world?
Well, if the government weren't doing it, I would be a lot more keen on gaining widespread acceptance of the forms of sex that might not lead to pregnancy.
Okay.
So there's all forms of touch sex and sharing masturbation that I think create a whole center zone. Particularly sharing masturbation creates a center zone where people do have a chance to experience themselves as individuals and experience others as individuals, and not get all mixed up in the karma of root chakra plunging. That's one form of sex, and it can be fantastic fun, and it has all kinds of outgrowths. But there's another realm of sex where we can meet on level ground and be completely sexual beings. That's amazing. I mean, I've had amazing experiences in group masturbation environments on various different coasts, in private and public settings, and some advertised and some not advertised, and some where I was a facilitator and some where I wasn't. But it opens up a whole new realm of sexuality. It's kind of like the playa at Burning Man. Have you been to Burning Man? All right, so Burning Man, I'll do a
kind of become more, I don't know.
No, I'm not talking about the behavior at Burning Man. I mean that Burning Man is like a city. This is not going to come up so well. Oopsie. So Burning Man is like a city in a kind of a horseshoe shape, and the streets and avenues come off this main boulevard, and in the middle of the boulevard is like 1 mile of desert called the playa. So it's this like little sea of desert in the middle of a huge city, and there's all this structured stuff going on the streets of the city. But if you venture out into the playa, you're kind of in this unstructured place where all kinds of other things are possible. And there's some art pieces out there, and you might, I once walked across the playa and found like a bedroom, just a bedroom with curtains hanging and the wind blowing, and it was called Psyche's bedroom. It was one of the most moving pieces of art I've ever seen or been in. Just that's it, right in the middle of the desert. But there's all kinds of other possibilities in this middle ground. And I think one thing about the way sexuality has been handled is that it has been pushed to emphasize penetrative, reproductive, rape-oriented sex, as opposed to all of the sensual and subtle sexual play that can happen that is completely written out of people like Andrea Dworkin, where there has to be any analogy between sex and rape. Well, if one form of sex is male female penetrative intercourse and another form is violent, well, that still leaves 98 other kinds of sex that can be experienced, far more than that. It obsesses me to see the government advising people to masturbate together and stay 6 feet apart, or to have sex through a wall, as the Vancouver, BC Health Department said. So now we're even
PCR is the new safe sex, right? You get your PCR test.
Oh yeah. Yeah, just like during AIDS, right? Just like during AIDS, where you flunk it, you go on AZT and you're dead in 12 weeks. That's nice. So I have a hard time seeing any of this as anything other than an anti-sex campaign. All of it. Feminism, Catholicism, the Supreme Court doing what it's doing. I live next door to the LGBT center, right next door. I wonder when the last time anybody talked about sex was in the LGBT center. We're talking about LGBT-ish stuff. And where's the bisexual programming? Nothing. There's nothing about bi. It's not even mentioned.
It's mostly the tea in my experience now.
Yes. So I want to see, and this was happening for a while in the late 90s and early 2000s. I mean, it was really happening. I mean, I once held a group masturbation experience at a poly conference that 54 people came to at the main lodge at Harbin Hot Springs. And the keynote address was this Deborah Anapol, this famous tantric teacher. And I basically took half her audience, but it was more fun to hang out in the main lodge up the hill at Harbin Hot Springs and check your clothes at the door and come inside, and people relating to each other as sexual equals. You want to do that? You put men and women together masturbating. Sexual orientation vanishes, monogamy vanishes, the fear of pregnancy and STIs vanishes. Suddenly the playing field is leveled and people all start to kind of seem the same. In a good way. Like, all right. So I love it all, but I will tell you, as someone who's done a lot of group masturbation experiences, that some of the most transcendent, genuinely loving, I'm a person, you're a person, sexual experiences I've ever had were in shared masturbation settings.
Interesting.
Because everything else is out.
I don't know if that's going to catch on though in the mainstream culture. Well, if people realized how much fun it was, it would catch on. But no, I don't think so either, because it requires a vulnerability that I think is alien to people in a lot of ways. And you got to check a lot of taboos at the door, or be willing to confront them. Yeah, I mean, I think the whole, just even the idea of vulnerability of any kind doesn't even have to be specifically sexual. There's just a complete, like, not even just a discomfort with it, but just a complete, like, no, I don't want to do it. If there's any risk, emotional risk involved, right? Like the whole words are violence thing. Then just, nope, I'm just going to stay home. I'm not going to interact. Send text messages, I'll get on Zoom, right? But to actually be in conversation or relation to other people in person. Yeah.
And I will tell you that the young men are terrified. Maybe they're not telling you. I know the young men are terrified that anything they say, do, or think about a woman is going to be construed as rapey. Oh, yeah.
And I mean, I'm obviously spend, my working hours in academia, and it is it's really hostile. It's just like, I mean, this is a whole nother topic, and I know I'm just looking at the time where we're like way over an hour, but like, I live in a very, very rural area. It is predominantly white, although we do have at my school we have a pretty high population of Pacific Islander students, but on paper, like in terms of racial diversity, it is not a particularly diverse place. Socioeconomically, it absolutely is. I mean, I have students, working full time, students, all sorts of different socioeconomic backgrounds and political backgrounds. But particularly like the white men, it is so clear to me that they don't even feel like their voice is welcome, like on any topic at all in the houses of academia. And I think that's reflective to some extent of some of the culture at large, especially, in leftist, quote unquote, leftist spaces. I think obviously it's really hard to be a woman in this culture. I think it's really hard to be a man as well.
Well, how about it's hard to be a people? I think that we need to start. I think that in many ways, feminism has run its course and outdone its use, and we now need to recognize that the same forces that would exploit women also exploit men. The exact same forces. Economic forces, criminal justice system forces, medical forces, all of this exploits men every bit as much as women are exploited. And I think that one of the crimes of feminism is not pointing out what has been done to men. This is answered partly by Susan Faludi in a book called Stiffed. She wrote the book Backlash. And then she followed up with a book called Stiffed. It is heartbreaking to read her studies of what happens to men in this culture and what happens to them because they're afraid of the reprisal of their wives.
Interesting.
They get fired, and if they can't tell their wife they got fired because if they did, they're going to be out on the street, or they fear that. So we have got to come to a place, I think, where we can have a real conversation about how hard it is to be a human on this planet, and not. Well, Zelbert Moore called it race hustling. I think that there's a lot of sex and gender hustling going on right now.
Yeah.
And a lot of discussions that are not happening. A lot of FTM men, right? Heck of a lot of FTMs.
Yep.
No, MTF, male to female trans. There's many fewer female to male.
Well, depending on what age demographic you're looking at, I think you're seeing a lot of like very young FTM, female to male.
Okay.
But yeah, I think by and large, like the older generations, you're absolutely right.
Either way, so what's the impact of all this hormone pollution on our concept of our sex and gender? I never hear that talked about. I wouldn't say I'm an expert in hormone pollution, but I could be an expert witness. It's serious shit. We're talking parts per trillion and every damn thing. So I get my environmentally friendly plastic cup, but I'm consuming phthalates and other plasticizers when I do that. So we are awash. And so this conversation is not happening either. I find this to be appalling that we're pushing trans on young people, but we're not talking about these completely hormone disrupting chemicals that we're all exposed to by breathing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that might be a whole nother episode.
It could be. I'm available, by the way, to your whatever program. If you want to put me in front of the Star Chamber and ask me any question you want, I will answer it.
Yeah, but I do think, the sort of trans lobby, obviously, in terms of medicalization, like you can't have transition without pharma, without industrial medicine, and it's very much connected to disembodiment, and right. I think it's also very like it's misogynistic. A lot of it's sort of these weird homophobic undercurrents as well, and these kids are so young. I mean, a lot of them are so young,
too young to have even found their voice sexually at all.
Yeah.
You need a lot of experience, and most people just end up in marriages and they don't get the experience. But to really find out about who you are as a sexual being, you need experience. I think.
Yeah, or even just, I mean, to have a body. Like, I mean, I think it's really fucked up. Like, your body's perfect, right? I mean, these children, their bodies are perfect, and we're mutilating them. Well, not we, but their bodies are being mutilated. And yeah, I think the long-term effects too, I'm very frightened to kind of see what comes of all this as these younger generations are growing up, and like most of them are going to be sterile. Many of them are not going to have sexual function at all, right? The ones that have really fully medicalized. So we're robbing them of, some of the choices that make us human. So it's anti-sex, anti-human. It's a very scary world that we're living in.
Well, we're making the world a little better by having this conversation openly. This comes in my general heading of how to have a conversation about sex and nobody flies off the handle or shuts anybody down with a moral issue.
Yeah, this has been a real pleasure, and I think it's just really great to connect. And obviously, I mean, we agree on some things, disagree on other things, but it's really, it's a rare gift in this current kind of culture that we're in, to be able to just have a conversation.
Thank you. And by the way, on any point we might disagree on, if we dug deeper, we might find common roots.
Totally. Yeah.
I mean, Lorraine Hutchins put that in. I'll send you this reference letter that I got from Lorraine Hutchins. At one point, an important teacher and professor of gender studies and bisexual activist. And she wrote me a letter of recommendation where she said something similar, where, well, you dig deep enough and you find out, well, actually, so I'm not so sure we're on different pages. I think we don't need to get very much past my recognizing your humanity and your right to make your choices, which I do. I affirm your right to make your choices, make your decisions, sexual and otherwise. And I think that if more of us could just get to that, we'd have a lot better world.
100%.
So on that happy note, anything else you want to add?
No, thanks for having me. This has been great. Yeah, I hope we have more conversations in the future.
Yep, anytime.
Oh, I should can I plug my podcast
Please do, and I'll link to it also. Yes.
Yeah, so I have a podcast I do once a week with a couple of my friends. It's called What's Left with a question mark at the end. It's on YouTube and all the podcast apps, and we're actually doing a little sex work series right now. We've put one out, and there'll be, I think, 2 more. So definitely connected to a lot of the stuff we discussed today. So yeah, thanks so much.
Good. Excellent. Thanks for being a guest.